welcome to my channel. I'm Jason White and this is Jason's Weird Reads, and today I am going to share my top 10 reads of 2022. So if you've been following my channel at all, you know I had a pretty rough year, but it's over. And of course I'm not expecting next year to be any better, and hopefully definitely not any worse. But my year of reading really reflected what was going on with me during 2022. And so I had to make a few changes, a little bit different changes from what I usually do. So in this list here, there are a couple of books that I wouldn't normally put on my top 10 at the end of the year. I like to keep it to novels only. But in this one, I added a couple of short story collections because I didn't have the best of reading years. I didn't enjoy everything that I read. In fact, a lot of the horror I read was sort of meh and not so good. And the only thing I kept as a rule to this list, I didn't put any nonfiction. So how about we get into it? Before, though, I get into the list proper, I would like to list a couple of honorable mentions. These are books I really wanted to get into here. Into the top 10 list itself, but one of them is just a short story, so I didn't really want to just have a short story in there, and the other one was a really good read, but it just I couldn't fit it in anywhere else. So let's get into that. The first honorable mention I want to talk about is the short story I mentioned, and that is The Hay Bale by Priscilla Bettis. Now, a lot of booktubers on here would recognize Patricia because she's a frequent commenter. She's always very supportive of booktubers, and I didn't even know she had released a book. It wasn't until a month or two after she released it that somebody was talking about it, and so I thought I'd go check it out, and I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's about a short story length. It's like 17 pages. I read it on my Kindle, and it was really, really well done, and I'm looking forward to reading more from Patricia. And the second honorable mention is Cannibal Creator by Chad Lutzke. I read this in preparation to talk with Chad Lutzke about this book release, and it was a lot of fun. It felt almost like a movie in a sense, and although I really enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it, especially if you like cannibal type stories, it just, I don't know, I think it needed just a little bit more in order to be added into the top 10 list, but it's still a really good read, and I really enjoyed it. All right, into the top 10. At number 10, I have one of the first short story collections I was talking about, and that is Tales from the Typewriter by Mark Allen Gunnels. And the reason why this is on this list is because it really had one of those short anthology, or not short, but an anthology movie feel. One of those anthology horror movies like Tales from the Crypt or Tales from the Vault from like the 1970s and maybe the 80s. Not so much these days. It had more of an old school feel to those old TV shows. And I used to watch those all the time. I still do, actually, but it was just a lot of fun. And one thing I really enjoyed from Tales from the Typewriter was the wraparound story. The wraparound story, I would say, is almost the best story in the whole thing, which isn't to take away from the other stories. It's just that it was really interesting. In at number 9, I read this early in 2022, and that is The Lost Village by Camilla Sten. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Anyways, this book has some very strong. I was surprised at how strong the Silent Hill vibes were in this book. But it's about takes place in the UK somewhere, I think. I can't remember. Sweden. Anyways, it takes place in a village that's been lost. All the people within the town have gone missing, and a camera crew, documentary makers, they want to go in and investigate as to why it happened. And the town is always foggy, and that's where you get the real strong Silent Hill vibes. And I just really enjoyed going into this town and seeing what happens to these people. I don't want to give too much away, but it ends up not being anything like Silent Hill. It's just the atmosphere. The atmosphere in this book is so thick that you can almost feel the mist on your face. In at number 8, I have Mr. Glowbones by Ronald Kelly. Now, this one I read for Halloween, and I absolutely loved it. I could also add in Seasons Creepings by Ronald Kelly. I was kind of about the two. I want to add them both here, but I'm going to stick with Mr. Glowbones because that one, it was just as awesome as Season Creepings. If you haven't read Ronald Kelly's short stories yet, or if you haven't read them at all yet, I highly recommend starting with the short stories, especially like Mr. Glowbones, Seasons Creepings, or The Halloween Store. Those are the ones I've read. I absolutely loved all of them. But Mr. Glowbones had really strong Halloween vibes, and if you're looking for those vibes at any time of the year, like a lot of us do, you need to go read this book, this collection of short stories. Next up, I have The Stone Serpent by Nicholas Kaufman. Now, I read this book in preparation to talk to Nicholas, and I was so surprised. I liked this book better than the first one, which is The Hungry Earth. But The Stone Serpent had a lot of... it's hard to say. It's not twists and turns. You're not gonna... There's not like really big reveal endings, but there are some reveals. I was surprised at where Nicholas took us in this book. And the science. Man, the science. I don't know if he throws more interesting science facts at us than he did in the first one, but it feels like more, and I'm all for the weird science stuff, and there's a ton of it in this book. The Hungry Earth, I believe, made like the number 10th spot on last year's list, and this one is at number 7, so I think the series is getting better and better. Hope I'm not putting too much pressure on Nicholas, because I know that positivity can be just as damaging as negativity, but yeah, definitely go read The Stone Serpent. You don't even have to have read the first one. This one, it really feels like it's its own book completely. Some of the events from the last book, The Hungry Earth, are mentioned in there, but you don't need any information whatsoever in order to enjoy that book, or The Stone Serpent. So definitely go pick that up. I really enjoyed it. In at number 6 is Breakfast with Buddha by Ronald Marullo. Now, this book was a surprise for me. I was looking for some books, fiction books, that had like a Buddhist element to it. And honestly, there's not too many. But this was one. It's more of a literary type tale, soul-searching type tale. And Breakfast with Buddha, it's not exactly what you think it's going to be. There's a lot of darkness in this book, mostly in reflection and rumination on American culture, Western culture, and how we live, how we treat each other, religion, and how religion tends to treat people. There's a lot of really interesting things happening. The basic premise is the main character takes a road trip with a Buddhist monk, and it leads to some very interesting, like I said, thoughts, and some interesting conversations, and some interesting spiritual growth. And it was just a lot of fun. I highly recommend this book, especially if you're interested in Buddhism at all and you just want to see what it's all about. This is, I think, a good place, even though it's not technically Buddhism that Ronald Marullo is writing about. It's sort of like an offshoot of Buddhism that he sort of made up as a basis for the fiction of this book. So anyways, I recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and it makes you think. In at number 5, I have one of the nastiest books I read this year, and that is Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. I'm always on the hunt for some science fiction horror, and well, this one was released last year. It's one of the newer books that I read this year that I really enjoyed. And this book, although it does have its flaws, the reason why it's here and why it's so high up on the list is because of the fun factor. The flaw being in that the first part of the book, you're in one time period. The second part of the book, you're in a second time period. And it feels like the first time period isn't exactly resolved at all. It's kind of cut off at the 3/4 mark, and then we're moved on into the future. It made absolutely no sense. It's like it almost felt like the publisher was like, we got to cut some of this, so how about we cut all this part and maybe just scatter some of the information in the second part. And it didn't work. We need that part. But and as to why they did that, the only thing I can think of, it's maybe for space. Maybe the book was too thick for a brand new author. I don't know, but what we do get in itself anyway is a lot of fun, and I can't recommend it enough. If as long as 2 timelines doesn't bother you, and one of them being kind of cut short doesn't bother you, it's space horror. If you love space horror, you gotta check it out. In at number 4, I have The Crown Tower by Michael J. Sullivan. I read this early last year, and it really it's a lot of fun. Like, this book is it's fantasy, it's epic fantasy, but it doesn't ever go too deep. There's a lot of kind of funny parts to it without being an outright comedy, and that's why it's on this list. It just helped me through a kind of tough time, and it brought my spirits up every time I listened to it. Now, this book sort of stands in, I guess, for the rest of the series of the Rhyria Chronicles, and I've talked about it a lot this year, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm hoping to get to the Rhyria Revelations this year, because that promises to be a lot of fun now that I have the Chronicles behind me. So I highly recommend that. If you haven't heard me talking about them, just go through my list. Within the last year, I've talked a lot about them. I don't want to go too much into it now because, as I said, I've pretty much exhausted the subject. All right, next up is another book I've talked about fairly extensively this year, and that is number 3 spot, and it is Ship of Fools by Richard Paul Russo. I first heard of this book on Rachel's channel from Shades of Orange, and she was talking about how she liked it. There's things about it she didn't like, but overall she liked it. I can't remember if it made a top 10 list of hers or not, but it's going to make mine here at the number 3 spot. And the reason for it is because, one, it took me a long time to read it, and I read it last winter through January and February, and it just kind of blew me away. At first, I almost didn't finish it because I didn't like the main character. The main character is handicapped. He has like this construct that helps him move around. And that's not the reason why I didn't like him. I actually respect that Richard Paul Russo added that element to the story. But the reason why I didn't like him is because he's when you first meet this character, I can't remember his name right now, but he is a slimy guy. He is so slimy. He backstabs people. He's you can't trust him. Just the way he thinks, it's not cool. But over the progress of the novel, you begin to really enjoy him, not because he's slimy, but because he starts to morph into something better, a better version of himself, and he almost becomes admirable by the end, if not completely admirable. The story itself is about a spaceship of religious people. I think they're Catholics, and they're looking for life on other planets so they can convert them to Catholicism, and they haven't had much luck. And they go to one planet that was colonized, and everyone on it is dead. And I'm going to leave it at that because that's the premise that I was going into the book upon. And this book is epic, man. It goes from where you begin in this book and where you end are completely different. It's an awesome book, and I can't recommend it enough. And so that is my space horror. And there's 2 space horror books I read last year, and they both made the top 10 list. All right, we're now in the last 2. This one surprises me that it's at the number 2 spot because it's a Christmas story, and it's a novella-length Christmas story, but I read it in 2 sittings, and it really reminded me of a lot of classic type of writing. I think the author went for a classic style of writing, and she succeeded. I'm talking At Christmas at Wheeldale Inn by Gemma Moore. This book is just, it's really good, and honestly, there's some scenes in this that gave me the shivers more than any other book I've read this year, or perhaps any other year. There's one scene in particular that really seriously creeped me out. It's a ghost story, and it ends at first, when I was reading this book for the first half, I was thinking, this is going to make the top 10 list for sure. Then something happens, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe not. And then the ending happens, and I was like, okay, it's back in. This book, you just can't figure it out, and it's very kind of strange by the end of it, and that's what I recommend. That's why I recommend, and that's why it's here at number 2, is because it's very strange and it's very creepy. It's about a husband and wife who are traveling. The husband, of course, this is the 1800s, and so late 1800s, if I remember correctly. And the husband was rich, but he's lost all his money, and so they're basically running away from the creditors because they'll throw them in jail. And so they're going to the wife's aunt's house because she's rich, and the husband is hoping to be able to just maintain their way of life and maybe bounce back. But they get into an accident that kills the coach driver and the horses, and they have to walk through the snow, and they find the Wheeldale Inn on their way. And I'm going to leave it at that. Like I said, it gets very creepy. It's a bit of a ghost story, but there's something else kind of weird going on. Gemma Amor, every time I read one of her books, it makes my top 10 list. So that should be motivation to continue reading her more. All right, the number 1 spot. Now, in my last video, I was wondering if this book would make the list at all, and I was kind of teasing it, but of course it made the list. It made number 1. And of course I'm talking about the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Now it's only the second one, but it's also, every time I read this person, they make my top 10 list at the end of the year. So Grady Hendrix did with the Southern Book Club Guides to Slaying Vampires. This is a throwback to a lot of vampire fiction that I enjoyed reading during the 80s. It just really had that. Actually, I think this book takes place at the end of the 80s to the beginning of the 90s. So it has a strong 80s feel, even though it's more firmly planted in the 90s. And that's why I loved it. All the references, you have the entirety of the 80s there at the beginning of the 90s. And so if you like that sort of thing, that's one reason to listen to this. But another reason, or read it, but another reason why I absolutely love this book were the characters. They felt very real. And of course there's the vampire, and I really loved the vampire. He's very very Dracula-esque in a sense, in that he can hypnotize people and make them follow him, and he's very powerful in that way, until of course one person sort of figures out what's going on and decides to fight back against him. This novel isn't necessarily about the vampire. The vampire could be anything. It's more so about the wife, the woman who figures out what's going on and trying to get people to believe her and to follow her into fighting back against this thing, because nobody will listen to her. But you get the feeling that if it was a man, one of the men who figured this out, everyone would be charging in with their swords drawn. But because it's her, everyone's like, oh, no, it can't be that. You're crazy. We're going to give you sedatives. We're going to throw you in a mental hospital. We're going to do everything but believe you. And that I think that was the reason why, just that commentary. I mean, it's still like that today, and that has to change, obviously. But there's so much more to this book. I think that it was just that one message that really spoke to me the most. And it's my top book for 2022. So there you have it, my top 10 list of 2022 books read. I read this year was full of a lot of rereads for me. I reread the Vampire Chronicles, a good part of the Witching, or the Mayfair Witches, and there's a couple other rereads I did. I reread Suzanne Hill's The Woman in Black, and I enjoyed that one actually a lot more than the first time around. It was great for reading for Christmas. That book starts off as like a family sitting around a fire telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, which is a very British tradition from my understanding. And so that was awesome. And there's a few other rereads. So this was the year of the reread, but I obviously fit in some others. And there's a lot of nonfiction that I read this year too. Like I said, it was a very strange year for me. and I'm excited to see what 2023 brings. There's, as you saw yesterday, there was 7 books, horror books, that are being released in 2023 that I'm really looking forward to. So tell me what your favorite reads were deep down there in the darkness. And if you made it this far into the video, leave me either a snowflake or a snowman in the comments there in the darkness, and I will leave you some in return. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking with me during this weird, strange year that I experienced, and I hope to be more productive in 2023. Happy New Year, and keep being safe and keep being creative, and I'll catch you guys in the next bookish video.